Each letter is a story. It's a memory in time, captured through a story in the person's words.
It's amazing how there was this camaraderie at the post office, wasn't it?
It felt like Postman Pat, actually, just driving around in a van, around the farms,
It's too good of a building to just be forgotten about.
It powered the final leg of the Industrial Revolution, served the nation through 2 world wars, and was a lifeline for those with loved ones on the other side of the world. Though it served the community for close to a century, Dewsbury Central Post Office on Wakefield Old Road now sits empty with an uncertain future. The legacy and memories of this historic building, however, can never be forgotten. My name's Ruby Jones, and you're listening to Post, Present and Future Destination Dewsbury. This 5-part podcast series is part of the Post Office Cultures Project and is dedicated to exploring the history of the beating heart of a historic West Yorkshire town, told through the voices of those who call it home one letter at a time. Hello and welcome to the final episode of Post, Present and Future Destination Dewsbury with me, Ruby Jones. In the last episode, we heard all about what it was like to be a postie in the 80s and 90s when Dewsbury Central Post Office was at its heyday with our interviewee Kevin Boniface. And for the final episode, I thought it would be nice to round this whole thing off with a chat with the lead of the Post Office Cultures Project, Rowan Bailey. In this informal interview/chat, we chat about the future of Dewsbury Central Post Office, as well as what is coming next for the Post Office Cultures Project. First of all, do you just want to tell us a little bit, very briefly, about how the project came to be and how you got involved with it?
Yeah, absolutely. The Post Office Cultures Project is a project that's funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and it's part of a specific scheme which is looking to foster collaborations between the UK and India, and collaborations across the creative and cultural industries. So one of the things that we were really interested in doing is fostering a collaboration between ourselves in the School of Arts and Humanities at the University of Huddersfield and World University of Design in Sonipat, which is just outside of Delhi. They're both creative practice schools and universities, and so we were really keen to explore scanning and architectural heritage, particularly around the phenomena of the post office in our daily lives. So if you're not familiar with scanning, 3D scanning, it's a piece of technology and a tool that you can use to gather an architectural 3D model of buildings. And quite often architectural 3D scanning is used for conservation and preservation. It's a documentary tool to capture the accuracy of a building. But what we're interested in is how that we can be creative with this scanning technology and create artifacts that might lend themselves to different forms of community engagement about place, about regeneration, about the future of the post office, about the post office in our everyday memories and experiences. So a lot of the project is actually facilitating community engagement activity around lived experiences of the post office, but also the connection between communities in India and communities in the UK, particularly South Asian communities. So a lot of the communities in West Yorkshire have South Asian heritage that have come to maybe places in West Yorkshire as part of migratory experience. And so we're also thinking about how to tell stories about that too through the post office.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. And you've just come back from India as well on an official trip as part of the project. Yeah, tell us a bit about that.
Oh, well, what a super experience. Yeah, so we went to India to visit our collaborating partners. So we spent a bit of time in Delhi. We went to see a really interesting post office on a roundabout in central Delhi near Connaught Place. And that post office is undergoing significant restoration. One of the interesting things about restoration, conservation and preservation of post offices in India is that they've got a lot of resource to do that. So in the Indian government, there is a department called Post Office GPO, General Post Offices. And inside that portfolio, inside that department, are about 59 general post office buildings across the whole of India that are protected. And so they are undergoing continuous conservation and preservation. And they work with an organisation called INTAC, which is the Indian Society for Architectural and Heritage Conservation, who work very closely with craftspeople to ensure that these buildings are restored to their originary status, architectural status. And they do all of this restoration work while these buildings are still functioning as post offices. So we went to India to see some of these restoration projects. We also went to Shimla, which is up near the Himalayas, up high in the mountains, to explore the Shimla General Post Office, which is also being restored. And we took some drones scanning of that building and are wanting to work with that data to generate some more stories around the conservation process in India.
Brilliant stuff. Yeah, that sounds really fascinating. Like you were saying before we hit record, like you were saying, there's a totally different attitude in India to old buildings and preservation of old things than we've got here in the UK, where things seemingly go out of fashion, don't they, after a few years and all that sort of stuff. Now, one of the most interesting things I think that we did for the Post Office Cultures Project was we held our pop-up shops, didn't we, in Dewsbury. That was a lot of fun. And I think for me, over the course of this project, the sort of the cultures part of it has sort of taken over, if that makes sense. From originally when I joined, I was very interested in sort of the data-driven side of it. When were these buildings built, etc. But the more I got into it, the more it just became driven by all these stories that we were hearing and all these stories that we found, and it was uncovering that community aspect of the post office, which was so interesting. And also in many ways it's a double-edged sword, because it was just such an integral part of people's daily lives that perhaps they never thought about it that much. So when we asked a lot of people about the post office, they could say, oh yeah, I remember it really well. I don't remember anything about it because it was just so normal. It's like brushing your teeth every day. You never think a second thought about it. Someone asked you, how do you brush your teeth every day? You think, well, just do it, really. And that's one of the things that I've come across as well.
Absolutely, embedded in people's everyday lives. So it becomes invisible. You're absolutely right in that regard. And also, I suppose, it's a really important cultural asset is a post office building in a place, isn't it? So it is part of everyday life, and we assume that it's going to be there forever. And then, of course, it's brought into question, isn't it, particularly in our deep hanging out in Dewsbury, that actually the big post office on Old Wakefield Road has become a real eyesore, and people are frustrated about that, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. Is your perspective on the post office changed from doing this project at all?
Absolutely. If I'm honest, I had a set of assumptions and perceptions about the post office prior to this project, and then maybe a little bit like it is part of everyday life and there's not much that we could talk about in terms of the post office. Obviously, I was very aware of the post office scandal, the Horizon scandal here in the UK, but once you start digging, you suddenly realise that actually it's a fascinating topic, and there's lots to be said about the architecture of post office buildings particularly, and what stories we can tell about place through a building. That's been a kind of a driving motivation for me thinking about the culture side of things. But what about you? What have you kind of learnt from this experience of hanging out in Dewsbury and doing the work that you've been doing?
I guess it sort of it restores your faith in small communities a little bit, doing something like that, because as we talked about with a lot of the people who would come to the deep hanging out, there's a lot of certain sort of Facebook groups about towns like Dewsbury, and it's the same sort of small minority sort of complaining about it. But when you're actually down there talking to people, 99% of them are really interested and they want to chat, don't they? And they say, oh, this is interesting, tell me about this. And it's been a really nice sort of thing actually to think, actually there's still that great sense of community in Dewsbury, just not maybe in the way that we traditionally first thought, but people are still interested in like doing the deep hanging out at the arcade. Cheeky sort of shout out for the arcade if anyone's in Dewsbury in the shopping centre. There's loads of old pictures of Dewsbury and the pictures of the old buildings and old books and stuff, and there was a great sense of community there, wasn't there? Like this is the town, like this is where we're at.
Yeah, and a sense of pride in place, isn't there? A sense of pride and attachment to one's heritage, the local cultural heritage of place, and also the great work that's going on around Dewsbury Arcade in terms of aspiration for thinking about, well, what's the future of Dewsbury with this new restoration, this regeneration work? How does that change our relationship to place?
Definitely, yeah. And like we've been doing these workshops with some students at Greenhead College where we've got them interested in letters and postcards. And I think it's like one of the questions that we've got asked a lot is why is this a relevant project? People don't send letters anymore. But then doing these workshops, we did these workshops, so they were maybe 16, 17 and 18. They really enjoyed looking at the postcards, didn't they, and writing on them. And do you think there is a future here for this industry, isn't there? Maybe just not in the way that we think. These, because it's retro now, and they enjoyed looking at it all from a retro perspective, and they got a lot of joy from it. And I thought, I was watching that and I was thinking, there's something here. It's possible to make a comeback.
But it's also quite profound, I think, because what we're maybe witnessing or experiencing is the transition from what used to be a very high-functioning communication system, the post office system, to a declining communication system, because we're now using different forms of communication that we don't need to use the post office for. There's a shift that's happening around the post office. The culture of the post office is moving into heritage, and maybe it's a living heritage or an everyday heritage, and an intangible heritage in a sense that we need to do more work with, because we might be living with these two different ways of thinking about the post office as it's still functioning, but also it moving into a heritage context, it becomes part of our culture. So I think that's really, really interesting for research, particularly, yeah.
Definitely, yeah. And one of the things that came up in the chat with Kevin in his episode was the great plight we've got in the current age with all the sort of different courier companies and delivery companies.
Yes.
And he was saying the biggest problem we've got with all of this is that we as the consumer aren't being given the choice as to who delivers our mail. You know, when we buy something online, it just gets sent by whoever is the cheapest, whoever's going to do it the cheapest. And he rightfully said, if we had the choice, 90% of us would say, "Oh, we'll choose Royal Mail."
Absolutely.
Because we know that. Because he was, you know, we were doing all the jokes, you know, your parcel getting thrown over the fence and all that sort of stuff. And he was saying that just doesn't happen with companies like Royal Mail, because they are so well established and because they are such a big institution. And the tragedy really is the lack of choice, isn't it, with things like that?
Yeah, and also I suppose we do have an emotional attachment to Royal Mail, don't we? You know, it is part of our history, our shared history.
Yeah.
And also there's pride in that, isn't there? You know, I think what's wonderful about Royal Mail and the conversations that you have about postal workers is that everybody feels a sense of emotional connection to the postie. You know, and actually the civic function of the post person is really, really important. We certainly kind of got that energy in India that civic role is still there, present and very much in focus. But we have to remember that India is an absolutely massive country, and so there's maybe a different kind of operation of that communication system.
I don't know anything about the side of it in India. So do they have a system similar to Royal Mail then, like a large company or?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty mirror to mirror. So we have to remember that this is also part of our shared complex colonial history. So if you're not familiar, the post office system, there was a post office system operating in India prior to the East India Company coming in and setting up what it called the postal system. So that was in the hands of the East India Company for many, many years, then before it was taken over and put into monarchy and government ownership. There is a shared history in that regard, and it's a shared and problematic history, because essentially what was happening by setting up the postal system in India and under colonial rule was to create a kind of a bureaucratic system for the ebb and flow of the British Empire and all of the horrific things that it was doing there. I think what I find very interesting about this project is that the emotional attachment and relationship to that history in the form of these massive general post office buildings in India that are all over the place, that actually the general sentiment is one of, I suppose, a sense that actually India has incorporated those buildings into its own cultural kind of condition now. And so there is a sense of, oh, this is just British era buildings. Whereas for us, in the UK context, there's a sense of like kind of great uncertainty about what that relationship was about, you know, and how we kind of work through a post-colonial kind of reading of these buildings today.
Yeah, definitely. That's really interesting, that sort of that aspect of it. So what's next for the Post Office Cultures Project? I want to talk a bit about the exhibition that's coming up and all the sort of the next steps.
Absolutely. We've got quite a bit more work to do, but what we're pilot testing in June right through to September of this year, 2026, is an exhibition at the Toast House Galleries on the University of Huddersfield campus. And so what we're going to do is develop a bit of a curatorial strategy around some of the research that we've done to date, and that will also include the Dewsbury case study of the post office there, thinking about adaptation and reuse of that post office for different kinds of needs in the future. We will also showcase the similarities and differences between post office cultures in the UK and India. And then we'll have a lot of community engagement activities running around the duration of that exhibition. So that's an opportunity for us to test out some of our ideas, some of our thinking in curatorial form, and how that might be received by a wide variety of different audiences and communities in the UK context. And then in February, we're off back to India, and we are going to have an exhibition out in India, in Shimla, and we will also have an exhibition in Delhi. And then in June of 2027, we will have, I think, fingers crossed, all being well, we are hoping to have an exhibition at Bradford Arts Centre about this project, because if you're not familiar, Bradford Arts Centre used to be a general post office in the centre of Bradford, Forster Square. So we wanted to work with the heritage of that building to explore some of the ideas around this project.
It's very much coming full circle there, isn't it? It ended up in Bradford Arts Centre. That kind of feels like a good place to have doesn't it? Like, it's pretty amazing that after all these years later, there's something about the legacy of the post office in that
Absolutely.
place.
And the potential of what post office buildings can be repurposed into that can service communities in that civic cultural way.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens to Dewsbury's post office as a result of this, whether there's going to be any more interest in the building, whether I'm sort of hoping that the arcade will be sort of a stepping stone, for the rest of the town centre, because that very much feels like a pilot, doesn't it? Sort of if that one goes well and if that one draws loads of people, then there's an incentive, isn't there?
Yeah.
And they're doing up Marketplace in Dewsbury as well at the minute, so there's all these other little projects going on. Well, thank you very much, Rowan. Thank you very much.
Thank you too.
And there you have it, the end of this podcast mini-series, Post, Present and Future Destination Dewsbury. Thank you so much for listening and joining me on this journey. I've learned so much about Dewsbury and Dewsbury Central Post Office, and I hope you have as well. If you want to follow the project, then be sure to check us out on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube. There's behind-the-scenes stuff, there's what we're going to be up to in the coming months. And I'd like to say for the very last time, thank you so much for listening. This podcast was produced as part of the Post Office Cultures project. The interviewee was Rowan Bailey, with editing and post-production from myself, Ruby Jones. Thanks for listening.